Hey guys, John here, and welcome back to the GForce OB-X tutorial series. In today's video, we're going to be focusing on the oscillators, the manual panel over here on the left-hand side, and the voice settings over here on the bottom right. So one of the first things we should know about is where to find the global master volume control. Now that's going to be in the left-hand side of the synthesizer. Under this manual panel, we're going to see a knob here called volume. So this knob is useful to keep our patches at a healthy and consistent level. So let's say we're putting together a preset bank. We want to make sure our patches are going to be at the same consistent level, not that patches are all over the place. And to the right of the volume control, we have a tune control. Now this can tune down the synthesizer down one octave, or we can go up one octave. And we can double click to go back to default. And what's really nice as well, we can hold down Control on Windows or Command on Mac, and then do some fine tuning as well. So right here, it's going to be 1.19. So next up, we have the transpose section down over here. Now, when we get to the oscillators themselves, you're going to notice that we can only pitch them upwards and not downwards. And because of that, I find that these transpose buttons are extremely useful. So here we have two buttons, one labeled down and one labeled up. The down is going to pitch the oscillators down one octave, and the button called up is going to pitch them up by one octave. Now, in the manual, it does mention that the filter tracking is not affected by these switches, and to actually use the transpose function on your MIDI controller for this subtle effect. Now, while this won't make too much of a difference to most people, I do feel like this was worth mentioning. So next up, we have this vintage knob. Now, this one is actually really cool. So this knob will decalibrate different parameters to give our patch more of a quote-unquote vintage sound to it. Now, all the way to the left, it's going to be off, so there's not going to be really any changes to it. And the more we turn it to the right, the more this decalibration is going to be introduced. So from an init patch, let's check out this vintage knob real quick here. So let's dial in one oscillator here, the second one as well, and then maybe a little bit of modulation for the cutoff. Let's bring our cutoff down a little bit, and maybe some resonance, so we have something like this. Let's bring in our vintage all the way. And off. Now here sounds very tight and tuned. And here it does not. So it's definitely kind of subtle, but it's also really cool. So here in the center of the synthesizer is our oscillator section. We have two oscillators, one labeled here and then the second one labeled here. Now for our oscillators, we can pitch these up from 0 all the way up to 48 semitones or 4 octaves each. They can be a saw wave, they can be a pulse wave, they can actually be a combination of a saw and a pulse, or we can make them be a triangle if both of these switches are off. And if we have our pulse wave selected, here we can change the pulse width here. And what's actually very interesting, we can go all the way up to 100%, resulting in silence. So from an init patch, let's take a listen to these waveforms real quick. So the first one is going to be a saw wave. Then we can go to the pulse wave, which we just saw. And then if we deactivate pulse as well, so both of these lights are off, it's going to be a triangle wave. And while it's not actually located in the oscillator section, we do have a noise oscillator over here in the filter section, so we can take away our first oscillator and introduce the noise. So in the center, we have a button called Xmod. Now, the idea here is that oscillator 2 will modulate oscillator 1. So what we can do to kind of listen to this here, we can drop this down an octave, bring this down an octave as well. So you have something like that, and maybe change oscillator 2 from a saw to a square wave. And now let's enable Xmod. So we have kind of a strange sound like that. Now, for a lot of the times, that might not be a very usable sound. But what we can do is actually just mix this in as a kind of a character to the main oscillator. So for example, we can bring oscillator 2 all the way, bring oscillator 1 down, and kind of slowly mix this in a little bit. Maybe a little noise as well. And bring it back to normal tuning. So next to the Xmod switch, we have another switch called Sync. Now, this is going to enable Oscillator Hard Sync, and the idea here is that Oscillator 2's waveform is going to restart every single time the waveform from oscillator 1 restarts. So to check this out, what we need to do is remove oscillator 1 out of the mix and bring in oscillator 2. So we have something like this. Now, once we enable sync, it's going to sound the same because these are going to be at the same pitch. It's only once we start deviating the pitch that we're going to notice this difference. So once we start changing this, notice the waveform up here starts to change as well as the spectrum down over here. Now, we're going to start to notice too, once we hit an octave, it's going to sound the same. So definitely keep that in mind. So as you've probably noticed by now, here in the filter section is where we're going to mix the level of our oscillators, and by default, we have oscillator 1 in the mix. We can introduce number 2, as well as noise. Something interesting as well to mention is that over here in the settings menu, what we can do is down over here in the OSC mixer view, by default, this is going to be on fine control. So these knobs here are going to be a fine control, right? We can change this to classic. So down now over here, these are going to be switches. So by default, if we go to an init preset here, this is going to be sending oscillators full volume into the filter. Or we can remove it and play nothing and we don't hear anything. Now for oscillator 2, we have half and full. Now full is going to be the same as this one, sending the signal at 0 dB or unity gain into the filter. Or we can go half, which is approximately down 5 dB. And we also have the same thing for the noise, so we can remove both of these here and listen to the noise half or full. And again, the same rule applies here. It's about a -5 dB down. And here we can enable keyboard tracking, which tracks the pitch of the notes and opens up the filter a little bit more as the notes ascend. So on the bottom right-hand side of the synthesizer above the keyboard, we see a panel called Voice Settings. Now here we can decide how we want the synth to behave as we play it. By default, we're going to be in poly mode. Now this is allowing us to play multiple notes at the same time. And here we have a choice of 16 different voices available to us. As we can see down here on this display, and we can click and drag and change this value in case we want something a little bit less than 16. We can also change this to mono mode with the switch down over here. Now this allows us to play one note at a time. And the thing to keep in mind for this is that this is going to re-trigger the envelopes every single time we hit a note. So for example, if we bring our cutoff down over here, give us a little bit of resonance and some modulation like this. So we see the movement here of the envelope. Now, regardless how we play it, every single time it's going to re-trigger those envelopes. What we can also do as well is we can go to legato. Now, this is similar to mono that it plays one note at a time, but it's only going to re-trigger the envelopes if we play a key, let go, and then play a key again. If we hold down a note and then add another note, it will not re-trigger the envelope. So for example, we hold down a note, envelope is triggered, and those will not be re-triggered as long as we're holding down a note. But if we play it individually, it's going to re-trigger those envelopes. So the last button on this list is going to be labeled Unison, and when we toggle this on, it's going to allocate all the available voices for each note that we play. And keep in mind, while we're in this mode, we can still use the functionality in either mono or legato mode, depending on how we want the envelopes and the LFOs to work. So let's go ahead and turn this on and see what this sounds like. Now, this might sound a little bit thin, and that's because none of these voices are really detuned against each other, which is why this detune knob comes in handy. So keep in mind that this detune knob only works for the Unison voices. If you want to detune the oscillators against themselves, you want to either do that here in the oscillator section or reach for this oscillator to detune in the control panel, which we're going to get to this panel a little bit later on in the course, but I do want you to know that this knob is available. So we have a fresh patch here, and I want to show you this advanced menu right over here. So in the voice settings on the top right, we see this ADV, and this is actually a button. So what we can do is first, let's go ahead and turn our Unison on, maybe give us a little bit of detune, something like this here, and then go to the advanced tab. So this is going to be the voice panning, and in the center, we have a couple different presets. So if we right click this here, we have the first one, which is going to be mono, which you can see all these knobs here. If we click on mono, they're all going to be up at noon, so in the center. And if we right click, we can go to narrow, and we can see these change just a little bit here. Or we can go to medium, they're going to change a little bit more, and then forward wide is going to change quite a bit. Now we also have separate controls, so we right click here, go to mono, so these are all kind of reset back to default. And for this example, let's go to 2 voices and then go back to our advanced panel. So we're really only using this knob here, this 1/9 and 2/10. So for the first voice, let's bring this all the way to the left. And for the second voice, we can bring this to the left as well. So now both voices are only going to be in the left speaker. And so here we can now bring this to the right to have a more stereo sound. And then now we can start introducing more voices. Maybe let's go from 2 to 4. And then now we're going to be using 3 and 4. So these knobs, so maybe we can keep them mono or straight up and down, or maybe pan them just a little bit. So now you might be noticing, okay, we have 8 knobs. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, and then we have 5, 6, 7, 8, but we have a total of 16 voices. So keep in mind, these knobs are labeled 1/9, 2/10, 3/11, 4/12, and so on. And that's because voices 1 and 9 are going to share the same panning, 2 and 10 are going to share the same panning, 3 and 11 are the same panning, and 4 and 12 are the same panning, so on and so forth. So that's why we have 8 knobs and we have 16 voices. All right, guys, well, that does it for this video. In the next video, we're going to cover the filter and the filter envelope. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you learned something, and we'll see you in the next one.